Hi, my name is Zoe John Kay. I'm a psychotherapeutic counsellor working in private practice with GSRD and neurodivergent clients. Today, I want to talk about a little discussed area of kink sexuality, Feedism. I hope that through the course of this video, you'll learn something about what Feedism is by providing a bit of a Feedism 101 and exploring some of the language and terminology. I'm going to look at different perspectives about Feedist identities and sexualities, as even within fat liberation, Feedism is pretty controversial. I hope that this will provide a starting point for challenging some of the anti-fat bias that practitioners carry with us into our work with clients. Although this video isn't specifically about unpicking anti-fat bias, it's impossible to understand the challenges that Feedists face in general, and particularly in coming to therapy, without understanding how anti-fat bias shapes all our views on acceptable bodies and sexuality. I'd like to give my thanks to Grace, with whom I had the privilege of sitting down for a chat about Feedist sexuality and Feedism. As well as telling me about some of her experiences, she helped me to draft some helpful pointers to make therapy more accessible to Feedist clients. I'll finish the presentation by providing some resources that could be helpful for therapists and clients, and a reading list of the references that I used in creating this presentation. So to start us off, let's get back to basics. What is Feedism? The definition here is from the group Feedists for Fat Liberation. As with many kinds of marginalized sexuality, different people within the community relate to Feedism differently. For some, it's an incidental thing that adds to their erotic enjoyment, while for others, sexual satisfaction isn't possible without the component of fat and food. Researchers Vivid et al. Proposed in their definition 4 elements to kink identity: sex, power, headspace, and community. Different kinksters may experience these things to different degrees, but some or all of these elements are likely to be present for all Feedists. Now let's look at some of the terminology you might hear in relation to Feedism. Feedism or feederism is an erotic interest in eating and gaining weight. I say erotic specifically because asexual Feedists describe erotic pleasure from the sensuality of food and fat, and from the power relations connected with Feedism, rather than specifically sexual satisfaction. A Feedist is a participant in Feedism. Participation could range from fantasizing about eating or gaining weight, feeding oneself, being fed, feeding others, or stuffing, which is eating large amounts of food to feel stuffed and experience a rounded belly, but not necessarily with the intention of gaining weight. Feeder and encourager are synonymous, but I'm told that feeder is a term more often used by straight Feedists, while encourager is more common amongst queer Feedists. Likewise, feedee is more likely to be used by straight Feedists, and gainer is a more popular queer term. The initialism terms at the bottom of this list are some of the ways that Feedists may refer to fat people in an erotic context. These are often tags for cam and clip sites and ways that adult performers identify themselves. Fat admirers may also look for these labels to find people that they're attracted to, but fat admirers aren't necessarily Feedists. Food and eating is what marks out Feedists from fat admirers or fat fetishists. Feedism as a kink has a particular intersection of oppression. The scholarly field of fat studies has built up a body of literature on the ways that anti-fat bias leads to fat people being rejected by society. Fat people tend to be perceived as lazy, unintelligent, smelly, dirty, and unattractive. Studies have shown that fat people find it harder to get work, as well as being paid less than their thinner peers. These social biases can make it hard for fat people in general to find romantic and sexual partners. It can be hard for people who feel that their body and their desires are likely to make them unlovable and undesirable. Feedism is a niche kink that many kinksters with knowledge of some of the smaller areas of the subculture don't know about its existence. I went on FetLife and found that while a search for rope yielded nearly 14,000 hits on individual profiles, Feedist brought up 12 people and feederism only 7. Feedism is a subculture that's relatively hard to find. Searching for porn using the tags BBW or SSBBW will bring a reasonable number of results, but like porn of all kinds, it's largely straight-focused and made for the male gaze. Even within fat positivity circles and fat liberation, Feedism has been disavowed. The National Association to Advanced Fat Acceptance, or NAFA, was originally created by a male fat admirer after meeting his wife to enable other men to meet fat women. Its origins in fat admiration hasn't stopped the organisation falling prey to the common myth that feedism is coercive and wrong. While no community can be homogenous, my experience of fat acceptance and fat liberation has been that much of the focus on liberating fat people from discrimination is based on not being to blame for being fat. Feedism, and feedies or gainers specifically, may challenge the feelings that some fat people have about needing to be a blameless member of a minority group in order to be treated with respect. Due to the biases in available information on feedism, professionals are likely to struggle to find information about feedism that focuses on individual autonomy and pleasure. There is relatively little research into feedism, but in the limited available literature, multiple papers characterized feedism as inherently coercive and as a type of intimate partner violence. As I've previously mentioned, most of the information available on feedism relates to cis heterosexual pairings generally, and to thin male feeders and fat female feedies specifically. The research seems to be based on some myths that I'll bust in the next slide about power dynamics between feeders and feedies, and on the expectation that all participants will be cisgender and heterosexual. Some of the biases deeply woven into feedism research are evident in comparators researchers use when contextualizing feedism, such as bestiality. Those of us who've spent years in LGBTQ+ communities will be familiar with the long history of elements of our communities being compared to people who have sex with animals to evoke disgust. There are also assertions that feedism replicates patriarchal sex, which shows a lack of understanding of how queer and neurodivergent much of the feedist community is. I find it interesting that when speaking with fellow professionals about feedism, the questions I've been asked most often are about supporting people to get out of the feedist lifestyle. As I prepared this presentation and talked about it with colleagues, I was asked by two separate people what I would do in two different hypothetical scenarios. Firstly, about a client who was a feedie, trapped with a feeder who would not stop feeding them. And secondly, about working with a feedie sex worker who felt her health and mobility was being impacted by having to keep gaining as a way to support herself economically. In both of these cases, there are simple answers that have nothing to do with feedism. If someone is in an abusive relationship, which the first example sounds like it is, they can find support to leave that relationship and get resources to help them. If someone is engaging in subsistence sex work and no longer wishes to do so, supporting them to consider alternative ways of supporting themselves and connecting them with resources to change job will help them to make the changes that they want to make. Both of these examples illustrate the way that widespread social fear of fat seem to make any problem for feedists about fatness rather than relational dynamics or the economic realities of marginalized people. The social fear of fatness and the moral connotations associated with fat mean it seems hard for many people to grasp the nature of the problem as being about anything other than feedism and fatness. Scholars of BDSM will know how the law has been used to prosecute kink practitioner for elements of their practice that constitute bodily harm. While some feedies may fantasize about becoming immobile, only relatively few feedists actively pursue this. As with other kinks that include body modification or physical injury, there may be complex legal waters to navigate in terms of safety, bodily autonomy, consent, and capacity to make decisions about one's own body. As with any kind of kink dynamic, there's always the possibility of coercion and exploitation. Although feedists pursuing weight gain to the point of immobility are likely to be relatively few. As with other areas of kink sexuality, theorists and lawyers have questioned if it's possible for anyone to give informed consent to changing one's body in a way that might negatively impact their physical health. If a kink-experienced therapist is approaching work with a feedist with a different perspective on risk-aware consent than they would with clients participating in other kinks, it's possible that they have some work to do on identifying their own understandable anti-fat bias. Now I'm going to move on to bust some myths about feedism. I listened to some great podcasts from the queer feedist Wood and had a fantastic chat with Grace, who I mentioned earlier, to break down some of the common misconceptions about feedism. This one I've already spoken about from a research perspective, but it's a common misconception that bears debunking. Feedist dynamics are as varied as the dynamics in other relationships and kinks. In their podcast, Wood hypothesized that most people can't fathom wanting to be fat or get fatter, and the only way that they can make sense of it is to see it as a form of coercive control. This myth also shows a shallow understanding of the diversity of kink dynamics. Some feedist dynamics are like Findom, where gainers demand money for food from their encouragers. Some feedies want to be in scenes with feeders where they are forced to eat until they become stuff drunk, which is described as a headspace, a bit like subspace. There are plenty of gainers who gain solo and have supportive and encouraging friends in the community who share fatspo in the same way that people in weight loss programs cheer each other on. It is, like so many things, not as simple as it might appear on first look. There are so many elements of feedism that people might be into, and not all of them are about getting fatter. Lots of feedies may choose to go stealth, or may prefer the consumption elements of the kink to gaining weight. Feedism is also about feeding, and not all feeders want to encourage their feedies to gain weight. For some, it's about care and nurture rather than getting fatter. This one is another area where porn and the more visible straight side of the kink has shaped understanding. Within the community, feedies are also likely to be feeders or encouragers to other feedies. Some feedies are thin, and lots of feeders are also fat. Again, nothing is straightforward. This one got a derisive snort from Grace when we discussed it. Of course, some people are into humiliation, the same way as other kinky people are, but it's far from all feedists. Many gainers want to be worshipped, and it's not unusual for encouragers to want to egg their partner on to become fatter so that they can experience being physically overpowered and dominated by them. This one is a common belief in lots of kink practices, but the intense scrutiny of fat bodies and widespread healthism and ableism in society make this myth particularly sticky. Wood's podcast is specifically about feedism wellness, and plenty of feedists are concerned about health and wellness. Grace, for example, has a personal trainer. However, even if it's not true, people take risks with their health every day. When I chatted about this with Grace, she said, "Everybody dies of something, darling." Just as many people can't grasp the desire to base jump or ski down red runs, others can't imagine intentionally taking the risk of becoming fatter. I want to talk a little about how we can better support feedist clients. Grace and I talked about her introduction to feedism. She was confronted with her kink sexuality when she fell for a supersized cam model and began an online relationship with her. Until then, she'd been trying to suppress her kink sexuality. She didn't feel that her kink was compatible with being a respectable spouse, parent, and employee. After starting her long-distance relationship, she was no longer able to hide from her sexuality. We talked about how her mental health suffered due to deeply internalized shame about feedism, and how, as someone attracted to women she describes as very fat, she believed the myth that desiring very fat women was tantamount to abuse. Applying minority stress theory to feedists can be helpful. Feedists having a positive view of themselves and a supportive community can be powerfully protective factors against the expectation and experience of stigma and discrimination. I've included some resources to help clients connect with like-minded kinksters at the end of the presentation. I asked Grace about her experiences with counselling and therapy, and she said she felt she couldn't talk about her desires because she didn't think that any therapist she could have found would have understood her. We talked about what might have made that easier for her, and she said that a therapist who said that they were fat positive or fat liberatory on their profile would have given her some clues that she'd find someone she could work with. Knowing that a therapist understands a bit about fat phobia and has examined some of their own anti-fat bias can give a feedist client confidence to speak about their desires. Kink experienced therapists are easier to find now than they were, but Grace wasn't sure that even a kink experienced therapist would understand her. The combination of understanding of anti-fat bias and of kink sexualities would help to make her more confident to open up to a therapist. A significant part of Grace's journey was discovering other feedists online. Providing clients who think they might be feedists with links to community could be a true gift for someone who is struggling with isolation and shame around who they are. The next slide has some links to resources that you could use to help better understand the community and share with clients to provide them with community and help them develop a more positive relationship with their own desires. And here we are. This podcast has some great episodes on a range of feedism topics, and I enjoyed the ones on the misconceptions about feedism particularly. We have an activism platform, a feedist dating site, and social media for building that all-important community. And here are my references that I used in creating this presentation. You can pause the video and take down any details if you need to. And I wanted to finish with Grace's beautiful feedist tattoo. Thanks again to Grace and to you for listening. I hope you found it helpful.